Over the years, I have often wondered why Lehi got in so much trouble. Why did the Jews get mad enough at him to want to kill him? Now I believe we have the answer. Lehi went against the reforms that King Josiah had begun in 620 BC. But the story begins a couple generations earlier. First, King Hezekiah, great-grandfather of Josiah, made significant reforms in the religion of Israel. First of all, he removed from the temple the Nehushtan, the brass serpent that Moses raised up when the people were besieged by flying fiery serpents. The Israelites had begun to offer incense to it, apparently treating it like an idol. He also removed from the Holy of Holies the original menorah, also called the Asherah. This stylized almond tree represented the Queen of Heaven and wisdom. Finally, he forbade the worship of God in any place other than at the temple in Jerusalem. Prior to this, Israelites had worshipped Jehovah at shrines on hilltops throughout the land. People were not happy with these changes, and everybody knew it. Not much later, emissaries from Assyria, which had recently carried away the northern kingdom of Israel off into captivity, they came to intimidate the people of Jerusalem. They publicly taunted them, saying in effect, "Why would your God protect you when your king doesn't even let you worship him?" I wonder if there was not some problem with the way the Israelites were worshiping Jehovah in those high-placed shrines that made Hezekiah feel the need to bring things under his own control. He wasn't a perfect ruler, but he did counsel with Isaiah on other issues. Be that as it may, despite his best efforts, after Hezekiah died, things went pretty much back to the way they had been. Then, when his grandson Ammon was killed by conspiracy, the people of the land placed Ammon's young son Josiah on the throne. This Josiah also attempted sweeping reforms of Israelite religion, and we'll look at these in detail. Remember that the high priest Hilkiah had found a copy of the book of Deuteronomy in the temple and had it read to Josiah. The reforms that Josiah began and which continued after him have been called the Deuteronomist Reforms, since they sought to bring Israel into alignment with that book. There is growing consensus among Bible scholars that the original Israelite concept of God was that El, the Lord of eternity, was the father of gods and men. He had a divine son, Yahweh, and a wife called Asherah. Gradually, El and Yahweh began to merge in the popular mind, and this is similar to the way later Christian churches lost the understanding that Heavenly Father and Jesus are actually separate persons. The Deuteronomists sought to finalize this process and merge them once and for all, El with Yahweh, in a strict monotheism. They sought to eliminate the doctrine of the Son of God. The Deuteronomists did not believe one person could atone for another. They didn't celebrate Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and consequently, they changed the function of the high priest. After all, his greatest duty was to enter the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement and make intercession on behalf of the people, offering himself through vicarious sacrifice at the symbolic throne of God. In preparation for that ordinance, he was anointed with the mark of a diagonal cross on his forehead, the same sign that Ezekiel, a contemporary of Lehi's, described as protecting the faithful from the angel of destruction. This was also likely the same sign that Jacob, the son of Lehi, refers to in his famous passage about looking beyond the mark. The high priest also wore a metal plate on his forehead inscribed with the word Yahweh, making it clear whom he represented, the Anointed One or Messiah. For generations, Jews mourned the loss of this anointed high priest and the substitution of lesser ones that only wore the priestly robes. Deuteronomy makes no mention of angels, and the Deuteronomists themselves denied their existence. The angels were the heavenly host, and one common name of God was the Lord of hosts. This also refers to the heavenly council and the sons of El, mentioned frequently in the Old Testament. But the Deuteronomist scribes and priests did not use the name the Lord of hosts. 2 Kings 23 says that Josiah destroyed the houses of the prostitutes in the temple. However, in Hebrew, angel has the same exact letters as prostitute, and Margaret Barker suggests that it was the shrines of the heavenly host that were destroyed and not some kind of temple brothel. Josiah, like Hezekiah before, removed the original menorah that represented Asherah, the wife of El, from the temple. The Deuteronomists denied that anyone could have a vision of the Lord. Thus, Deuteronomy chapter 4 claims that Moses never saw God. even though Exodus 24 makes it plain that not only did he see the Lord, but that the elders of Israel were with him when he did. These reforming scribes and priests maintained that all that was necessary was the law of Moses, and that there could be no continuing revelation. Clearly, not everybody shared this view, and the words of the prophets were recorded, but often outside the Bible. The Deuteronomists suppressed the idea of the Melchizedek priesthood in favor of the Levitical priesthood. They tried to obscure the spiritual creation of the world that preceded its physical creation. And they maintained that there could only be one temple, that at Jerusalem. And also they tried to suppress the writings associated with Enoch. So how did the Deuteronomist priests and scribes try to influence the religion of Israel? Well, first of all, they acted with the king's authority, forbidding some modes of worship and prescribing others, as we've said. Next, they focused attention on the book of Deuteronomy, which they at very least altered significantly, and some scholars believe it was actually written by them specifically to justify their aims. Next, they edited or altered the histories that we now have as 1st and 2nd Kings to condemn the actions of some past rulers and promote those of others. Finally, they tried to remove altogether from circulation certain books that were not in accordance with their ideas, especially those that dealt with Enoch and Melchizedek. This process began in Josiah's day and continued throughout the captivity in Babylon, and even after their return to Jerusalem, resulting in the form of the Old Testament that we have today. But now, returning to Lehi, knowing this context, the prophet Lehi's actions and teachings now fit perfectly. He gets into trouble for the things he teaches because they're in direct opposition to what King Josiah is trying to do. He testified of the Anointed One and the need for atonement, 1 Nephi 1:19-20. He claimed prophecy and a vision of the Lord that prominently featured the heavenly host, 1 Nephi 1:8. In his vision, he sees one very special member of the heavenly host that we can all recognize as the Son of God, and his ancient audience too would have recognized it in 1 Nephi 1:9. Lehi's sons also reflect this opposition to the work of the Deuteronomists. Nephi says that the Old Testament that would go forth would be missing the words of many prophets and many plain and precious things. It sounds like he is referring to the Deuteronomists' effort to suppress certain books and alter others, 1 Nephi 13:23. 2 Nephi 5:16 shows that Nephi built a temple in their new home. For generations, the Book of Mormon was criticized because clearly any Jew would have known that there could only be one temple, that at Jerusalem. But now we know that that's not true, and the Israelites built temples in many, many places. In Jacob 4:14, Nephi's brother says that because the Jews looked beyond the mark, they would reject Christ. Viewed in light of Josiah's purges and Ezekiel 9, this would appear to mean that because they rejected the role of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, they would miss the role of Christ, to whom that high priest represented. So, in multiple and specific ways, Lehi and his sons perfectly, and surprisingly, fit into the great controversies of their day. This would, of course, be way too much to ask of luck if Joseph Smith had fabricated their story. Impossible. The Book of Mormon flies in the face of everything that people thought they knew about biblical history back in the 1800s, and only looks better and better as more discoveries are made and digested. It turns out that there were many people that thought Josiah's reforms were a disaster. The year after Josiah's reforms started, Jeremiah was called to prophesy against, quote, the people of the land. Well, this is the exact same name given to those that conspired against King Ammon and put Josiah in power in the first place. And there's evidence that many other groups besides Lehi's left Jerusalem at this time, including a large group of priests that actually went to fight on the side of the Babylonians. So, elements of the original Hebrew religion that Josiah tried to suppress were preserved outside the Bible, in the Enoch literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other writings. And now we can add to these the Book of Mormon. The implications which the Deuteronomist Reforms have for Mormonism can hardly be overstated. Josiah's purges explain important differences between Christianity and traditional Judaism, and even more so between the restored gospel and those two remnants of the truth. It helps us understand the way the Bible developed and how certain key doctrines were lost. But most dramatically, our understanding of Josiah's reforms show that the opening chapters of the Book of Mormon are a perfect bullseye. the right time, the right place, the specific controversy. Once again, time vindicates the prophet Joseph Smith and that marvelous work and a wonder, the Book of Mormon.